Hello, this is Dr. Martin again, and this is again week 4 in General Biology 1114 at Rogers State University. So this is chapter 21. There are a couple of chapters we're going to talk about this week. In week 4, we started with the first series of lectures in chapter 19, where we talked about plants. Here in chapter 21, we talk about animals, and then we'll do another chapter here in another section of notes later in the week, maybe by Tuesday or Wednesday. So here we are with animals, chapter 21. Now, the notes that I have a link for you to connect with your notes, the PowerPoint notes. I've really trimmed those down. There were over 100 slides, and I've really trimmed those down in this lecture. It's still going to be a lot of slides, but we're going to go through them rather quickly on each slide. So it'd be better to study these lectures as opposed to the links to the PowerPoint slides in the previous module or the previous link. So here we are, chapter 21. These are the animals. You're going to be very familiar with every group of these animals that we talk about. If not, I'm going to point them out so that you realize you are more familiar with them than you think you are. Animals, extremely diverse again, not quite as diverse as the plants, but very diverse. Notice down here in the far right-hand corner, I'm kind of covering it up a little bit, but we start with the most primitive sponges. We work our way up into complexity to flatworms, mollusks, more worms, arthropods or insects, the echinoderms, and eventually the chordates or the vertebrates. So this slide kind of goes backwards, but that's how we work in complexity with the animals. So what makes an animal an animal? You might think, hey, there's some very specific cellular or biological differences between plants and animals. Some of these are very obvious to you, but let's point these out. Animals, they have eukaryotic cells, which are more complex cells, like the fungi, like the protozoans, like the plants. They are all part of the eukarya. Okay, more advanced, more complex cells. Animals are they're multicellular. Remember, the eukaryotes that are one cellular are protozoans or protista. We go through several stages of development, what we call blastula stages of development. At one time, you were a blastula. Several hundred cell divisions after fertilization was a blastular stage of development. And all of these animals, they're heterotrophic. Remember, hetero means other, trophic means energy. We ingest our foods. We're not photosynthetic, even though that would be kind of cool to lay out in the sun and photosynthesize for your energy and for your carbohydrates. But we as animals, we have to ingest our food. So those are some key, this is an important slide, key characteristics of plants, just like there are some key characteristics of animals and or plants and animals. Make sure you know those differences. We classify all animals into 9 major groups. Remember, this is the domain Eukarya. The kingdom is Animalia. And then the phyla or phylums are these right here, starting with the most primitive at the top, the sponges, the cnidarians, working our way down to the chordates or the vertebrates. Here's how we classify animals. Here's how we break them into groups. First of all, we have tissues. In zoology, the first thing we study is tissues. Remember, cells are grouped together to form tissues. Tissues are grouped together to form organs. So all animals exhibit a tissue layer of complexity, especially the sponges. The most primitive animals, they start with a layer of tissues. Then we have symmetry. Just see if we can explain what we mean here by symmetry. You and I, if we can only be divided into equal halves by a single mid-sagittal line, we have what's called bilateral symmetry. Not all animals have bilateral symmetry. Sponges and they really don't have a symmetry. They have asymmetry. There's no specific symmetry with sponges. But look here with some of the higher organisms like a hydra, or think of a jellyfish or a sea star. They have what's called radial symmetry. They can, looking down on top of them, they can be divided by multiple lanes, multiple planes into what we call radial symmetry. But then another type of symmetry I've already alluded to, and that's those of us that have bilateral symmetry only. We can only be divided into two identical halves by a single plane or a single line. That's what we call bilateral symmetry. That's another way that we divide or classify animals. We also classify them based on an internal cavity. You have an internal cavity. It's called a coelom. Look here at the bottom. These are the planaria, or the most basic coelom. See the internal cavity here, internal gut cavity. But look, as we increase in complexity, this internal coelom becomes a cavity inside of a cavity, and even higher, a cavity inside of a cavity that's surrounded by muscular layer. That's what we call a coelom. And the complexity of this coelom determines the complexity of animals. And that's how we classify animals. We also classify animals based on whether they have a digestive tract. All animals have to eat. They all ingest foods, but some of them don't have a complete mouth to anus cavity. You and I do, and higher animals do. They have a complete digestive tube from mouth to anus. Some of the lower animals do not. They simply have a gut that has a terminal end and does not have an anus. And so, like here, this is a sea anemone here that has a digestive tract, but it's a dead end digestive tract. And so we classify animals based on their digestive tracts. We also allocate groups of animals based on their segmentation. Like here's a millipede that has multiple body segments. They don't have a million, but they are millipedes. Centipedes are a little bit different. It's dependent on the number of legs per segment, but they have a lot of segments in their body plane. You and I, we just have basically a head and a chest. Insects have a head, chest, and abdomen. So segmentation is how we classify animals. We also classify animals on how they develop embryonically or in their juvenile stages. Notice in this first development here, the juvenile stage resembles the adult stage. This is a salmon here. But notice down here, we have a different kind of metamorphic development where the larval stage doesn't look anything like the adult stage. And so this is another way that we classify or break animals down into different levels of complexity based on their juvenile development. So let's do this. Let's talk about each one of these 9 different groups of animals. And we're progressing pretty fast. I'm going pretty fast here, and I'm going to go a little faster. But you need to make some notes here, some mental notes as we go through these, because I'm going to require you to know representative animals in each of these 9 groups. Let's start here with the sponges. The sponges are the most primitive animals. Notice here, they're at the bottom of this evolutionary scale here. They are animals. They are, hey, have you ever had a real sponge? Most of the sponges we buy at stores like Walmart or Safeway or whatever, well, they're artificial or synthetic sponges. We actually have some real sponges in our lab on the RSN campus. It's amazing how much water they can absorb and hold. But sponges have been around for centuries and used for bathing, used for cleaning, used for disinfecting. But these are natural sponges, native sponges. Not like the artificial or synthetic sponges we buy in stores now. All of them are aquatic. Hey, we have sponges in our ponds and streams and creeks and lakes in Oklahoma. Now, they're small, but they are also anchored to a surface. They don't free float. We call that sessile. They're anchored to a substrate. They have hollow bodies. They're either asymmetric or radial symmetric, but these are the sponges. Water tends to move in and out of this tube. They have a hollow inner tube. Water moves in and out of this tube, and that's how they feed. They have to move water in and out of this tube using currents of flagella inside their bodies to create these currents. They reproduce by budding off or pinching off asexually, but they can reproduce sexually by producing sperm cells that have to, there's no contact between adjacent sponges, but they have to release these sponges into the water and hope that the currents carry the sperm to an adjacent sponge with egg cells. Hey, the next group, notice I have all of these highlighted in red. The sponges were before. These are the cnidarians. You're very familiar with the cnidarians if you've ever, especially if you've ever been to the ocean or some type of salt water. These are jellyfishes, corals, sea anemones. All of these are the cnidarians. The C is silent in how we pronounce this term, the cnidarians. They are radially symmetrical. We have to look down from the top to create identical planes of symmetry. But these, you've seen these before. Maybe you've been to the aquarium in Jinx, but you've seen these in zoos. If you haven't been to an ocean, you're pretty familiar with these. But the cnidarians have stinging cells. That's one of the classic characteristics of the cnidarians. They do sting. If you've ever been stung by a jellyfish, you know what I mean. They have cnidocytes, which are they're harpoon-like projections that can project out and grab prey so that they can feed. And these nematocysts, that's what these harpoon projecting cells are, that can sting and collect and attract prey. So that's the classic characteristic of the cnidarians. Jellyfish are classic examples. I was in Hawaii a year or so ago, and I saw these moon jellies all over the place. They just float in the water. The sea anemones, all of these have a double life cycle. They exist as medusas like this in their adult form, and these are the polyp forms here that are not the adult stages, but oftentimes the adult will pinch off from the end of the juvenile stage here. So they have two life forms, the medusa form and the polyp form. And that's classic for cnidarians. So really two characteristics, the nematocysts, the stinging cells, and then their alternate life forms, adult versus juvenile life forms. Again, know each one of these, or they're highlighted in red. Know some classic characteristics of each, and know some representative organisms from each. Here's the flatworms. They're classified a little bit more complex than the sponges and the cnidarians. We also have a really long name here, and I apologize, but it's the platyhelminthes. But we just, for our intents and purposes, we call them the flatworms. They are bilaterally symmetric, just like you and I. It takes a single plane to divide them into equal symmetry or halves. So these are these are the flukes. You've heard of tapeworms before, the flatworms before. You've heard of planaria. Here's the planaria right here. Some of these are extremely parasitic to humans, especially in third world countries. They don't have an internal coelom. They do have multiple branches of their internal cavities for their digestion, but they don't have an internal cavity like what we're going to see here in some of the other groups. But notice here in the tapeworm, there's different kind of tapeworms. There's beef tapeworms. There's pig tapeworms, but they attach in the intestinal walls of their host, and then they slough off eggs by the millions through the feces, and that's how they get back into the soil and get reinfected back into other hosts. Here's a planarian that you're familiar with. We have planarians in waters of Oklahoma. We have cave planarians that I study. But planarians, you've seen planarians in many other different experiences that you've had with science. Look at this. They do have a nervous system. We didn't see that with the cnidarians or the sponges. They do have a very primitive brain. They have very primitive eye spots. They are very tactile, and chemical sensitive. They have nerves that extend all the way down through the end of their body. But this is a classic characteristic of the flatworms. They have a very primitive nervous system, highly parasitic, that we've talked about, living in the intestines of their host and releasing eggs through their feces. Here, just multiple. Some of the flukes are in third world countries, especially in Asia, Southeast Asia, some in Central America, very mostly very moist environments, but very highly parasitic. Usually do not cause death. Pretty rare to have deaths associated with tapeworm or parasitic flukes, but some of them have multiple life stages, multiple hosts. Fish are often a host, a mid-level host. Snails are often a mid-level host for these, but very complex life cycles and multiple hosts. Here's the mollusks, and the mollusks are a pretty diverse group. You're familiar with most of these. The snails fall into this category. The oysters, clams fall into this category. These are the mollusks. Snails, I think I mentioned snails, but they have a mantle that secretes a hard shell. They have a foot that they use to move along. They have a radula that's used for feeding, pretty complex. Their digestive system is pretty complex. Here are several of these here. Here's the snails. Here's the slugs. Hey, looky here. We have the octopus. We have the squid that falls into this category. Scallops fall into this category. Really, we could break it down to these groups here. The bivalves are the shelled mussels, oysters. The gastropods have spiral-like shells like the snails. The cephalopods, cephala means head, and these are the squids and the octopus. But all of these are mollusks, pretty diverse group. They have a lot of different organ systems. They're more complex than what we've talked about. They reproduce sexually. Very well developed nervous systems, brains, eyes. The largest invertebrate in the world is the giant squid with eyes the size of basketballs. Very well developed brains, very well developed eyes, and other sensory organs. Here's the bivalves, or the anatomy of a clam or an oyster. We have mollusks, freshwater mollusks, all over eastern Oklahoma. Some of them are endangered species, highly endangered species. The Neosho clam is on the verge of being an endangered species. But hey, you've eaten these before. You've eaten squid. What do we call it? What's squid that you can eat? I've eaten squid before. The tentacles, pretty much. You've eaten oysters. Clams and oysters are great fish bait. I don't like eating them because I kind of know what I'm eating. I teach a lot of zoology, so I try to avoid clams and oysters. But hey, a lot of people love them. It's hard to watch people eat them, but they're definitely a delicacy. Snails, don't people eat escargot, snails? But anyway, let's move on to the next. So these are the annelids. These are segmented worms. Worms probably don't seem to be quite as complex as the octopus and squid, but they have some very complex body structures. These are the segmented worms. Earthworms fall into this category. Leeches fall into this category. Very a little bit more complex systems that we've seen in the other animals. But the leeches and the earthworms are those that we find in Oklahoma. A lot of leeches in our freshwater streams in eastern Oklahoma. If you've ever been swimming in Flint Creek, Spavinaw Creek, the Illinois River, I mean, the potential to have a leech is not unlikely. They're not harmful. They do drink blood and they eat small animals, but earthworms you're much more familiar with. You can find them in your backyard, find them in your garden. You fish with them, but these are the segmented worms, multiple body segments. They have many organs. They have hearts, multiple hearts. They have a digestive system. They have a coelom all the way from the mouth to the anus. That's why they're classified higher than some of the other organisms that we've talked about so far. They have a mouth. They have a nerve cord. They have a brain. They have complex structures that make them classified higher than other organisms. Here's the nematodes. Now, these are unsegmented worms. These are round worms. The reason why they're so important is they're very parasitic. Roundworm parasites are, especially in underdeveloped countries, third world countries, Southeast Asian countries, Central American countries, roundworms can be very parasitic, usually not causing death, but can be very parasitic. Pinworms, heartworms, hookworms, these are some of the worms that you're familiar with, heartworms in dogs, but pinworms and some of the other worms are it's been estimated that as high as 30% of children can be infected with some pinworms in certain very rural parts of the United States. 1 in 3 children can be infected with pinworms. Probably the highest parasitic rate in the United States are these round worms, especially pinworms. Hey, let's move on quickly to the arthropods. We simply can't spend much time here on the arthropods, the phylum Arthropoda. And here, look at these groups here, the old fossilized trilobites. Look at here, the crustaceans, okay, the lobsters, the crayfish, but look right here, the insects. Over 1 million arthropods, 95% of them are insects. More species of insects than all other animals combined. 1 million different species of arthropods. We simply can't do them justice by how much we can cover here on the arthropods. Arthropods have segments to their bodies. Okay, they have a very tough, look at this, exoskeleton. Exo means out. You and I have an endoskeleton. Arthropods have an exoskeleton. This exoskeleton does not grow well. You and I have a skeleton that grows internally throughout our lifetime. Arthropods, not the case. That's why they have different life cycles. They go through metamorphosis. Here's the cicada that you're going to be familiar with in the summertime that sing. They have to go through different molts of their exoskeleton in order to grow, unlike you and I. So they molt as they grow, and they leave these behind as they grow. Here's a grasshopper, classic insect, 6 legs. Some arthropods have 8 legs, and they're classified as the spiders. Some have 6 legs and classified as the insects. Some have multiple legs, like the crayfish. Look, here's the 3 body segments of an arthropod: the head, the thorax, and then the abdomen. So head, thorax, abdomen. That's 3 parts. Usually the thorax has the wings attached, the abdomen is the reproductive parts, and of course the specialized systems of the head. So the head, thorax, and abdomen, 3 body segments of the arthropods. Some are very complex. Respiratory systems, they breathe in and out. They have a trachea, they have lungs for gaseous exchange, a complete mouth to anus digestive system, have a circulatory system. They do bleed. Their blood is a little different than yours and I's, but very complicated nervous system. But this group is highly diverse, the most diverse of all of the animals fall into this group. Okay, here's an ancient group right here, the trilobites. You've seen trilobites fossils. Here's the we don't have time to talk about the arthropods anymore and their complexity and their diversity. So let's move on quickly. Here's the echinoderms. The echinoderms are sea urchins, starfishes, sea dollars, sand dollars, sea cucumbers, pretty diverse, pretty large group. And look how high we're getting on the evolutionary scale here. But these are the echinoderms. Pretty complex group, very complex digestive systems, very complex nervous systems, multiple layers of tissues. They go through metamorphosis. Hey, here's a starfish, so many different types of starfish, and so many different numbers of appendages. They have a vascular system. They don't have blood, but they have a water vascular system that moves substances throughout their bodies. Quickly, here's the highest group of all of the animals. These are the chordots, the chordated. We also call these the vertebrates. But look here, they're at the very top of the evolutionary scale for the animals. Here they are here. They kind of go upside down here, but we'll get to the mammals here in a minute, which are classified as the highest. Most of the chordates have a vertebral column. You have a vertebrae, a backbone is another way of saying this, or a spinal column is another way of saying this. We don't see this in any of the lower animals. So these are the vertebrates. Any of the groups of animals we've talked about so far are called invertebrates. They lack a vertebral column. So everything we're going to talk about here are the vertebrates. And they have jaws, also very complex jaw structures. They have limbs. They have lungs for breathing. Some of them are a little primitive, like in the amphibians, but very well developed lungs in the other ones. They also have an embryonic sac that the embryo develops in. Sometimes that's encased in an egg. Sometimes it's developed inside in an amniotic sac, like inside the humans or inside the mammals. So thermal regulation, some of them have body covering for thermal regulation. We have hair, birds have feathers, multiple heart chambers. These are all ways that we classify the vertebrates. So let's start here. I have them identified here in blue. Let's start with the most primitive of the vertebrates, and these are the fishes. Pretty big group, obviously all aquatic. They may be either freshwater or saltwater. Some have the ability to move in between freshwater and saltwater, but boy, that creates some hardship. Usually they're pretty isolated to either saltwater or freshwater. Living in between is really tough, but these are the fishes. Very abundant, very diverse group of all of the vertebrates. Some fish, we classify fish into two groups. Those that have cartilage skeletons, these are the cartilaginous fishes. Look here, here's the rays. I've been diving in Cancun, and I saw a lot of rays, and I saw a few sharks too. But the sharks and the rays are a different group of fish than the fish that we see in Oklahoma. These are their skeletons are made of cartilage, but sharks and rays fall into this category. But then we have the bony fishes, where their skeleton is bone tissue, just like your tissue and my tissue. Hey, you've cleaned fish before, you've eaten fish before, so you know what kind of bony fish we're talking about here. All of the major structures intestinally, all of the major structures from a nervous system standpoint are found in the fishes that we find in humans. But they have definite either cartilaginous fishes or bony fishes. Here's, again, increasing in complexity. Here's the amphibians. Okay, the amphibians still kind of isolated to moist environments, but they do make that transition to land. They also can be tetrapods. Tetra meaning four, pod meaning foot. They have 4 feet, 4 legs. Look here, here's a salamander here, but we also have some frogs fall into this group here. Frogs, salamanders, toads. You know what we're talking about here. Look, we're getting pretty high on the evolutionary scale here, but they are relegated to moist environments. They have to reproduce by laying eggs or sperm in pretty moist environments. They do have lungs, but they're not very well developed. Look here. Here's the lung it's just not very well developed in the amphibians. So they still diffuse oxygen and carbon dioxide out through their skin. So that's why they need moist environments. Pretty developed circulatory system. They do have blood. They do have red blood cells, just like you and I do. They have a 3-chambered heart, but they do breathe through their skin more than they do through their lungs. Here we are with the amniots. They have these are the two groups that have an developing embryo within a sac, whether covered by an egg or not. And these are so these are the reptiles and the mammals. Sometimes it's a leathery egg, sometimes it's a hard shell egg, but that depends on whether it's a reptile or a mammal. The reptiles were the first vertebrates to really thrive on land. 60 million years ago, they were the dominant animals on Earth, and very diverse at that time. We only have a few remaining reptiles that survived. We call those extant species that survived past extinctions. You know what they are. Okay, basically the alligators, the turtles, the tortoises. These are the surviving reptiles that have adapted to live on land. Here they are here, the turtles, the tortoises, the snakes, the alligators, lizards, and look right here. Your text classifies birds as reptiles. Isn't that crazy? Because birds, feathers are adapted scales. And so, hey, your text and your author and most mainstream biologists now classify the birds as a reptile. Isn't that crazy? So we kind of have to change our way of thinking sometimes as we study animals. So these are the 5 different groups, the remaining reptiles after the extinctions about 65 million years ago. Very diverse group. Some of them very long living. Some tortoises and some turtles have longer lifespans even than humans do. Very tough protective shell. Those are the turtles. Turtles technically are aquatic. Tortoises live on land. That's how we distinguish between the two groups. But very distinct vertebral column. Hey, here's the birds, and they have adaptive scales that are feathers that are well adapted to flight. There's a few flightless birds like the ostrich, the emus, some other flightless birds in the past, but that have survived some extinctions. But look at this, they have hollow bones. You know this, makes them very lightweight, very specialized for flight, very muscular breastbone that allows them to fly. But these are the birds. Here's the mammals. Birds and mammals are very unique and the most highly specialized of all of the vertebrates and all of the mammals, all of the animals. They have a very constant internal body temperature, what we call homeostatic. They are endotherms, meaning they generate their heat internally. So the birds and the mammals are the most highly specialized of all animals. Mammals probably also evolved from the earliest of reptiles, but they are very warm. They have hair. These are mammals. They also drink milk that's where we get the word mammal, from mammary glands. They have a developing embryo inside of an amniotic sac. Um, but these are the mammals. The most primitive of the mammals do lay eggs. It's kind of a soft, more of a reptile-like egg rather than a bird-like egg. These are the echidnas and the platypus. There's only three species, two species of echidnas, one species of platypus. A really funky looking mammal, but definitely a bill-like mammal. But these are the most primitive mammals. Marsupials are the next more complex mammals. They have a long gestation time inside of a pouch. The kangaroos, the joey that develops inside the pouch. Opossums is our own. The possums are only North American marsupial that we have. You know this, where most of the marsupials develop, about over 200 species in Australia. But that's what we call a marsupium. But most of the mammals are a much larger group that have true mammary glands, um, have a long gestation period, have generally speaking, a pretty long infancy period before they develop into adults. They have a placenta where they feed as a developing embryo. They do have mammary glands where they get their food. Look at this. We don't often think that some aquatic species of mammals, the dolphins, the porpoises, and the whales, fall into this group. They are mammals. They breathe air. They have developing young and amniotic sac. They have mammary glands. So yes, dolphins, porpoises, and whales, they are not fishes. They are mammals. And then of course, the most terrestrial mammals, those that have an abundant hair. Manatees are aquatic mammals as well. So here's some key vertebrate adaptations. Hey, we're almost done here. Hang with me. Here's some of the key adaptations of the vertebrates. But we're going to move on and end right here. Long lecture, I apologize. But chapter 21 are the animals. Chapter 19 was plants. Chapter 21 animals. And then we're going to move on to another lecture this week in the next series of lectures.